The old ceiling fan in courtroom number 3 made a soft clicking sound with every rotation. It had been doing that for years and nobody had bothered to fix it. Judge Helen Morrison barely noticed it anymore. She'd been sitting on that bench for almost 30 years, and the familiar sounds of her courtroom were like white noise to her by now. It was a Thursday morning, and the schedule was packed. 3 custody hearings, 2 traffic violations, and a dispute over a property line. Just another regular day in family court. Judge Morrison took a sip of her coffee and glanced at the next file on her desk. Mitchell versus Mitchell. A custody case. She'd seen thousands of them. The courtroom was smaller than most people expected when they saw it for the first time. Not like those dramatic rooms you see in movies with tall ceilings and fancy wood paneling. This was a working courtroom in a county courthouse that needed a fresh coat of paint. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air conditioning unit rattled in the corner whenever it kicked on. Linda Mitchell sat at the table on the left side of the courtroom. She was wearing a navy blue dress that she'd bought specifically for today. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, but her fingers kept fidgeting with the edge of a tissue. She'd been up since 5 in the morning, too nervous to sleep, running through everything her lawyer had told her to say and not say. Next to Linda sat her attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. Patricia had handled dozens of custody cases, and she had that tired look that lawyers get when they've been doing this work for too long. But she was good at her job. She knew how to present a case, how to make her client look stable and responsible. Across the aisle sat Robert Mitchell. He wore a button-down shirt that was slightly too big for him now, though it had fit perfectly 6 months ago. His tie was crooked, but he didn't seem to notice. His lawyer, a younger man named Derek Walsh, kept organizing and reorganizing the papers in front of them, a nervous habit that he'd developed early in his career. Between the 2 tables, in a chair that seemed too big for him, sat 10-year-old Tommy Mitchell. He wore khaki pants and a polo shirt that his mother had laid out for him that morning. His sneakers didn't quite touch the floor when he sat all the way back in the chair, so he perched on the edge, his feet planted firmly on the ground. Tommy's eyes moved back and forth between his parents. He'd been doing that a lot lately, like he was watching a tennis match. Back and forth, back and forth. His mom wouldn't look at his dad. His dad kept trying to catch his mom's eye, but she'd turn away every time. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Frank who was counting down the days until his retirement, stood near the judge's bench. He'd announced the case a few minutes ago in that bored voice that bailiffs use when they've said the same words 10,000 times. Judge Morrison put on her reading glasses and opened the file. She scanned the basic information. Married for 12 years. Divorced 8 months ago. 1 child. Standard custody dispute. The mother wanted primary custody with the father getting every other weekend. The father wanted joint custody, 50-50 split. She'd read it all before. Different names, same story. It always amazed her how people who once loved each other enough to get married could end up sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom, fighting over their children like they were dividing up furniture. Mrs. Chen, Judge Morrison said, looking over her glasses at Linda's attorney. You may proceed. Patricia Chen stood up, smoothing down her jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. We're here today because my client, Linda Mitchell, is seeking primary physical custody of her son, Tommy Mitchell, with reasonable visitation rights for the father. She walked toward the center of the courtroom, carrying a folder. The facts of this case are straightforward. Mrs. Mitchell has been the primary caregiver for Tommy since his birth. She has maintained a stable home environment, ensured consistent school attendance, and provided for all of Tommy's emotional and physical needs. Linda sat up straighter in her chair, trying to look like the stable, responsible parent her lawyer was describing. She snuck a glance at Tommy, hoping he was listening, hoping he understood that everything she was doing was for his own good. Furthermore, Patricia continued, Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated a pattern of unreliability. In the past 6 months since the divorce was finalized, he has missed 3 scheduled visitations with Tommy. He has been late with child support payments twice, and there have been multiple instances where he has failed to communicate schedule changes in advance. Robert shifted in his seat. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, a silent message to stay calm, to not react, but Robert could feel his face getting hot. Everything she was saying was true technically, but she wasn't telling the whole story. She couldn't tell the whole story because she didn't know it. Nobody knew it except him, and he'd made sure of that. Judge Morrison was making notes. She'd heard variations of this speech 100 times. Stability, consistency, pattern of unreliability. The words changed, but the melody was always the same. Tommy sat very still in his chair. His hands were gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. He knew what was coming. He'd been to these meetings before, in the social worker's office and in his mom's lawyer's conference room. Everyone talked about him like he wasn't there. Everyone had opinions about what was best for him, but nobody asked him what he wanted. Well, that wasn't completely true. The social worker had asked him questions. Lots of questions. But they were the wrong questions. They wanted to know which parent's house he liked better, which parent helped him with his homework, which parent made him feel safe. They didn't ask him the questions that actually mattered. Patricia Chen was still talking. She'd moved on to discussing Linda's job as an office manager at a dental practice. Steady employment, good benefits, flexible hours that allowed her to be there when Tommy got home from school. She painted a picture of stability and routine, of homework at the kitchen table and bedtime stories and regular meals. Your Honor, we have several witnesses prepared to testify to Mrs. Mitchell's character and her dedication as a mother, Patricia said. But before we call them, I'd like to submit the social worker's report for your review. Judge Morrison took the document that the bailiff handed her. She'd already read it, of course. She always read the social worker's reports before the hearing, but she flipped through it again, reviewing the key points. The social worker, a tired woman named Beverly who'd been doing this job for 15 years, had interviewed both parents and Tommy. She'd visited both homes. She'd talked to Tommy's teachers and his pediatrician, and her recommendation was clear. Primary custody should go to Linda Mitchell. The report noted that Tommy seemed well adjusted at his mother's house. He had his own room, decorated with posters of his favorite baseball players. He had a consistent routine. His grades were good. He had friends in the neighborhood. The report on Robert's situation was less glowing. He lived in a smaller apartment. Tommy didn't have his own room there, just a pull-out couch in the living room. Robert's work schedule was less predictable, and there were those missed visits, those late support payments. What the report didn't say, what it couldn't say, was why any of that was happening. Because Robert hadn't told the social worker. He hadn't told anyone. Derek Walsh stood up for his turn. He was younger than Patricia, less experienced, and it showed in the way he cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Your Honor, my client loves his son very much and wants to be an active part of his life. The divorce has been difficult for everyone involved, and Mr. Mitchell admits that there have been some scheduling challenges. However, he's committed to maintaining a strong relationship with Tommy. It was a weak opening and Derek knew it, but he was working with limited information. Robert had been evasive when Derek asked about the missed visits. He'd given vague answers about not feeling well, about having some personal issues to deal with. Derek had tried to get more details, tried to build a stronger case. But Robert kept insisting that they just focus on his love for his son and his desire to be in Tommy's life. Linda's lawyer had character witnesses ready. Tommy's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was sitting in the back of the courtroom waiting to be called. So was Linda's sister, Karen, who would testify about what a devoted mother Linda had always been. Robert's side of the courtroom was emptier. He'd asked his brother to come, but Michael was out of state on business. His mother had offered, but Robert had told her not to come. He didn't want her to know what was really going on. He didn't want anyone to know. Judge Morrison was listening to Derek make his case, but she was already forming an opinion. She'd seen this before. A father who meant well but couldn't get his act together. A mother who'd been carrying the load for years and deserved to have that recognized. The law talked about the best interests of the child, and in this case, that seemed pretty clear. Tommy could feel it. He could feel which way things were going. His mom's lawyer had made her sound like Supermom. His dad's lawyer had made his dad sound like he was trying but failing. And nobody had talked about the thing that actually mattered. He wanted to stand up right then. He wanted to shout it out. To make them all stop talking about visitation schedules and child support payments and who had the better bedroom setup. But something held him back. Not yet. Not quite yet. The teacher was called to the stand. Mrs. Peterson walked up to the front, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She talked about what a good student Tommy was, how Linda always came to parent-teacher conferences, how she was involved in the school community. And what about Mr. Mitchell? Patricia Chen asked. Does he attend school events? Mrs. Peterson hesitated. He came to the fall festival last year, and I believe he was at the spring concert. But I see Mrs. Mitchell much more frequently. More points for Linda's side. The scales were tipping. Linda's sister took the stand next. She talked about how Linda had always been the responsible one, even when they were kids. How she'd helped raise Karen after their mother got sick. How she was naturally nurturing, naturally good with children. Judge Morrison was making more notes. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't going to be a difficult decision. Robert sat at his table, feeling the case slipping away from him. Derek had warned him this might happen. Without telling the full truth, without giving the court a reason to look past the missed visits and the late payments, the decision would likely go Linda's way. But Robert couldn't tell the truth. He'd made that decision months ago and he was sticking to it. He had his reasons. Good reasons, he thought. Though sitting here now, watching his chances of spending time with his son disappear, he was starting to wonder if he'd made the right choice. Tommy was watching his father. He could see something in his dad's face that other people might miss. Pain. Not the kind of pain you get from a scraped knee or a stubbed toe. Something deeper. Something that had been there for months now, getting worse. Judge Morrison closed the social worker's report and looked up at both attorneys. Unless there's anything else either side would like to present, I'm prepared to make my preliminary observations. This was it. This was the moment where the judge would essentially tell them how she was going to rule. There might be more paperwork to file, more formalities to complete, but everyone in the courtroom knew that what she said next would determine Tommy's future. Patricia Chen smiled slightly. She could feel the victory coming. Derek Walsh looked defeated. He'd done his best with what he had to work with, but it wasn't enough. Linda felt relief washing over her. She'd been so worried, so afraid that the judge might not see things her way, but it was going to be okay. Tommy would be with her. That's where he belonged. Robert felt his chest tightening. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself, and Tommy, sitting in his chair between his parents, felt something snap inside him. He couldn't stay quiet anymore. He couldn't let this happen without saying what needed to be said. He'd been carrying this secret for 3 weeks now, and it was crushing him. His dad had made him promise not to tell, but this had gone too far. Judge Morrison opened her mouth to speak. Based on the evidence presented and the social worker's recommendation, I'm inclined to award primary physical custody to... The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Tommy stood up. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him. He had 2 words to say. Just 2 words. But they would change everything. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Judge Morrison stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still partially open. Linda's hand flew to her chest. Robert's head snapped up, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Tommy stood there, his small frame trembling. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The courtroom that had been full of voices and shuffling papers just moments ago had gone completely silent. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to stop clicking. Frank, the bailiff, took a step forward. He'd seen people interrupt court proceedings before, usually angry parents or emotional witnesses. But this was a kid. A scared-looking kid who probably just needed to use the bathroom or something. Still, protocol was protocol. "Son, you need to sit back down," Frank said, his voice gentler than usual. But Tommy didn't sit down. He didn't move at all except for the slight shaking in his hands. His eyes were locked on Judge Morrison. There were tears building up, making his vision blurry, but he blinked them back. He needed to be strong right now. He needed to say this. "Tommy, sweetheart, sit down," Linda whispered urgently, reaching out to touch his arm. But Tommy pulled away. Patricia Chen stood up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Your Honor, if we could have a brief moment to..." "He's dying." The 2 words came out louder than Tommy had intended. His voice cracked on the second word, but everyone heard it. Crystal clear. Impossible to misunderstand. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the quiet of a paused conversation. This was the silence of shock, of a room full of people trying to process what they'd just heard. Judge Morrison's face changed. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and older somehow. She'd been a judge for 3 decades. She'd heard confessions, outbursts, breakdowns. She'd seen people at their worst and occasionally at their best. But something about the way this child said those words, the desperate certainty in his voice, hit her differently. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her pen. "What did you say?" Tommy's breath was coming in short gasps now. He felt like he couldn't get enough air. The tie his mother had made him wear suddenly felt too tight around his neck. But he'd said it. He'd finally said it out loud. And now he couldn't stop. "My dad is dying," Tommy said, and this time his voice broke completely. The tears he'd been holding back started streaming down his face. "Nobody will tell me the truth, but I know. I found the papers. I saw the medicine bottles. And everyone is just sitting here talking about schedules and who has the better house, and none of it matters because he's dying." Linda gasped. Her hand went to her mouth and she turned to look at Robert with an expression that was half confusion, half horror. What is he talking about? But Robert wasn't looking at Linda. He was staring at his son with an expression that confirmed everything. Resignation. Pain. And something else. A kind of relief. Like a man who'd been carrying a heavy weight and had finally set it down. "Robert?" Linda's voice was sharper now, demanding. "What is he talking about?" Derek Walsh, Robert's attorney, turned to his client with wide eyes. "Is this true? Why didn't you tell me?" The courtroom erupted into noise. Patricia Chen was trying to object to something, though it wasn't clear what. Frank was still standing there, unsure whether to make the kid sit down or not. Mrs. Peterson, Tommy's teacher, had both hands over her mouth. Linda's sister Karen was leaning forward in her seat, trying to hear better. "Order," Judge Morrison said, but her voice came out weak. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Order in this court." The noise died down, but the tension remained. Everyone was looking at Robert now, waiting for him to deny it, to tell his son that everything was fine, that it was all a misunderstanding. Robert slowly stood up. His lawyer tried to pull him back down, whispering urgently that he needed to be quiet, that they needed to talk before he said anything. But Robert gently moved Derek's hand away. "It's true," Robert said. His voice was quiet but steady. "I have cancer. Stage 4, pancreatic." Linda made a sound like she'd been punched. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Judge Morrison removed her reading glasses with shaking hands and set them down on the bench. In 30 years, she'd never had a hearing take a turn like this. She looked at Tommy, who was still standing there crying, and then at Robert, who looked like he was about to collapse. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said carefully, "I'm going to ask the bailiff to clear this courtroom except for the immediate parties. Then I think we need to have a very different conversation than the one we were having." But Tommy wasn't done. Now that he'd started talking, everything was pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. "I found the papers 3 weeks ago," Tommy said, his words tumbling over each other. "I was looking for my baseball glove at Dad's apartment and I found them in a drawer. Medical papers. They said pancreatic cancer, stage 4, poor prognosis. I didn't know what prognosis meant, so I looked it up on my tablet." He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "It means they don't think he's going to get better. It means he's going to die. And I asked him about it, and he made me promise not to tell anyone. He said it would make things complicated. He said people would treat him different. But I can't keep it a secret anymore because everyone is fighting about the wrong things." Linda was crying now too. "Robert, how long have you known?" Robert sat back down heavily in his chair. He looked exhausted, like just standing for those few seconds had taken all his energy. 6 months. I found out about a week before you filed for divorce." 6 months? Linda's voice rose. "You've known for 6 months and you didn't tell me? We were married for 12 years and you didn't think I deserved to know?" "We were getting divorced," Robert said, and there was a hint of bitterness in his voice now. "You made it pretty clear you wanted nothing to do with me anymore." "Why would I tell you?" "Because we have a child together." Linda was standing now too, her hands flat on the table. "Because regardless of what happened between us, I needed to know that Tommy's father was sick." Judge Morrison stood up. "That's enough. Everyone, please sit down." She waited until Linda and Robert had both lowered themselves back into their chairs. Tommy was still standing, still crying, but quieter now. "Tommy," Judge Morrison said gently, "I need you to sit down for a moment, okay? Can you do that for me?" Tommy nodded and sat down. His whole body was shaking. The judge looked at Frank. "Clear the courtroom." Everyone except the parents, their attorneys, and the child. Now, Mrs. Peterson stood up reluctantly, along with Linda's sister and the handful of other people who'd been waiting for other cases. They filed out slowly, craning their necks to see what was happening, whispering to each other. Frank closed the courtroom doors behind them with a solid thunk. Now it was just the 6 of them. Judge Morrison, Tommy, his parents, and their 2 lawyers. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, more real. Judge Morrison sat back down and leaned forward on her elbows. She looked tired suddenly, every one of her 62 years showing on her face. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I'm going to need you to explain this situation fully. And I mean fully. No more secrets, no more hiding things. Do you understand?" Robert nodded. He looked at his lawyer, who was frantically scribbling notes and still looked completely blindsided. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the diagnosis," Judge Morrison said. "When exactly did you find out, and what did the doctors tell you?" Robert took a deep breath. "It was March 15th. I'd been having stomach pains for a while, and I finally went to see a doctor. They ran some tests, did a scan. The doctor called me in and told me I had a tumor in my pancreas. A big one. He said it was stage 4, which means it had already spread." Linda was crying quietly now, her hands covering her face. "They said I could do chemotherapy," Robert continued. "It wouldn't cure it, but it might give me more time. Maybe a year, maybe a little more, so I started treatment. That's why I missed those visits with Tommy. I wasn't being irresponsible. I was in the hospital getting chemo, too sick to even stand up, let alone take care of a 10-year-old. Derek Walsh finally found his voice. "Robert, why didn't you tell me? This changes everything about the case. The judge needs to know these things." "Because I thought it would make things worse," Robert said. He looked at Judge Morrison. "I thought if the court knew I was dying, there'd be no way you'd let me have time with my son. Why would you give custody to someone who won't be around in a year? It seemed like telling the truth would guarantee I'd lose him." "So you thought lying was better?" Patricia Chen said, her voice sharp. But Judge Morrison held up a hand to silence her. "What about the child support?" the judge asked. "The report says you were late twice." "Medical bills," Robert said simply. "My insurance covers some of it, but not nearly enough. The chemo costs thousands of dollars per treatment. I've been doing it every 2 weeks. I was choosing between paying my medical bills or paying child support on time. I figured being alive was more important than being on time with a check." Tommy was listening to all of this, hearing details his father had never shared with him. He'd known his dad was sick, but he hadn't known how sick. He hadn't known about the treatments or the bills or how hard his dad had been fighting just to stay alive. Judge Morrison looked at Tommy. "Son, why did you decide to speak up today?" Tommy wiped his eyes again. His voice was small when he answered. "Because nobody was listening. Everyone kept talking about what was best for me, but nobody asked me what I wanted. And what I want is to be with my dad. I don't care if he doesn't have a big house or if he's sick. He's my dad. And if he only has a year, then I want to spend that year with him. I don't want to look back when I'm older and realize I wasted all this time fighting in court instead of being with him." The words hung in the air. A 10-year-old child speaking with a clarity and maturity that most adults never achieve. Understanding something that the lawyers and the social workers and even the judge had missed. That time was the most precious thing, and they were wasting it. Linda was sobbing now, really sobbing. Not the quiet tears from before, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. "I didn't know," she kept saying. "I didn't know. Oh God, Robert, I didn't know." Robert's eyes were wet too now. "I know you didn't. That was my choice. I didn't want pity. I didn't want people treating me like I was already dead. I just wanted whatever time I have left to be normal, to be with my son, to not have everything be about cancer." Patricia Chen looked like she didn't know what to do. Her entire case had been built on Robert being an irresponsible father. And in the span of 5 minutes, that narrative had completely fallen apart. She glanced at Linda, waiting for some signal about how to proceed. Judge Morrison stood up. "I'm going to call a recess. 30 minutes. I want both attorneys to meet with me in my chambers in 15 minutes. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, you need to talk to each other. Really talk. And I suggest you include your son in that conversation." She looked at Tommy and her expression softened. "Young man, what you did today took tremendous courage. I know that wasn't easy." Tommy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The judge gathered her files and walked toward the door to her chambers. But she paused before going through, turning back to look at the small family sitting in her courtroom. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the law isn't equipped to handle the most important things. Sometimes we get so focused on rules and procedures that we forget we're dealing with people's lives. Real people. With real pain and real love and real fear. I won't forget that today." And then she was gone, leaving Robert and Linda and Tommy alone in the courtroom. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had just been revealed pressing down on them. Finally, Linda stood up and walked over to Robert's table. She stood in front of him, looking down at this man she'd been married to for 12 years, this man she'd loved and fought with and divorced, this man she thought she knew. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." And Robert, who'd been holding everything together for 6 months, who'd been carrying this burden alone, finally broke down. Linda wrapped her arms around him, and he buried his face in her shoulder and cried. Tommy got up and joined them, and the three of them stood there in the empty courtroom, holding each other like they hadn't in years. Outside, the people who'd been asked to leave pressed their ears to the door, trying to hear what was happening. The court reporter, who'd been recording everything, sat with her hands frozen over her keyboard. Frank stood guard at the door, his eyes a little misty, and in her chambers Judge Morrison sat down at her desk and put her head in her hands. After 30 years on the bench, she thought she'd seen everything. But today had reminded her that every case was different. Every family had their own story, and sometimes the most important thing a judge could do was listen when someone finally found the courage to speak. The darer. 3 of them stood there holding each other, for what felt like forever but was probably only a couple of minutes. Linda was the first to pull back, wiping her eyes with the tissue she'd been clutching all morning. She looked at Robert, really looked at him, and suddenly saw all the things she'd been too angry to notice before. The way his shirt hung loose on his frame, the dark circles under his eyes that she'd assumed were from stress. The way he moved slower now, like every action required extra effort. How had she missed all of this? How had she been so blind? "Sit down," she said softly, guiding Robert back to his chair. "You look exhausted." Robert didn't argue. He was exhausted. The chemotherapy drained him in ways he couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't been through it. It wasn't just being tired. It was like his bones were made of lead, like his body was fighting a war with itself and losing. Tommy pulled up a chair and sat next to his dad. He put his small hand on Robert's arm, and Robert covered it with his own hand. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Linda grabbed a chair from the other table and sat down facing them. For the first time in months, the 3 of them were sitting together without lawyers between them, without anger filling the space, just a family dealing with something impossible. "Tell me everything," Linda said, "from the beginning. I need to know." Robert took a shaky breath. "I started feeling sick around January. Just little things at first. My stomach would hurt after eating. I felt tired all the time. I thought maybe it was stress from the divorce. Or maybe I was just getting older." Tommy listened quietly. He'd heard some of this, but not all of it. "By February, I couldn't ignore it anymore," Robert continued. "The pain was getting worse. I wasn't sleeping. I'd lost some weight. So I went to my doctor and he ran some tests. Blood work, scans, the whole thing." Linda's face was pale, but she nodded for him to continue. "When he called me back in, I knew it was bad. Doctors don't usually ask you to come in for good news. He showed me the scans. There was a mass in my pancreas about the size of a golf ball. He said based on the images and the blood work, he was pretty sure it was cancer, but he wanted to do a biopsy to confirm." "That must have been terrifying," Linda whispered. "It was," Robert admitted. "I went to that appointment alone. Sat in the parking lot afterward for an hour, just trying to process it. I kept thinking about Tommy, about how I was supposed to tell him that his dad might be dying." Tommy squeezed his father's arm tighter. "The biopsy confirmed it. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma, stage 4. The doctor explained that stage 4 meant it had already spread beyond the pancreas. He said pancreatic cancer is one of the hardest to treat because usually by the time you have symptoms, it's already advanced." Linda closed her eyes. She'd heard of pancreatic cancer before. She knew it was bad. "Really bad. He gave me options," Robert said. "I could do nothing and probably have a few months. Or I could do aggressive chemotherapy, which might give me a year, maybe more if I was lucky. The chemo wouldn't cure it. It would just slow it down, buy me time. So you chose the chemo, Linda said. Of course I did. I wasn't ready to give up. I'm still not. Robert looked at Tommy. I wanted every extra day I could get with him. Derek Walsh, who'd been sitting quietly at the table, finally spoke up. Robert, I need to ask this. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why keep it a secret? Robert was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. A lot of reasons, I guess. Pride, mostly. I didn't want people feeling sorry for me. I didn't want to be the sick guy that everyone tiptoes around, and honestly, I was afraid it would hurt my chances with Tommy. He looked at Linda. We were already fighting over custody. I thought if you knew I was sick, you'd use it against me. Or worse, you'd tell the court that Tommy shouldn't be around me because it would be too traumatic for him. I thought keeping it secret was the only way to still be his dad. Linda shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I wouldn't have done that. Robert, I'm not a monster. If I'd known, I know that now. Robert interrupted gently. But back then we were both so angry. We weren't talking, we were just fighting through lawyers. Everything felt like a battle. I didn't trust you and you didn't trust me. That's where we were. It was true and they both knew it. The divorce had been ugly. They'd said terrible things to each other. They'd stopped seeing each other as people and started seeing each other as enemies. Tommy had been watching this whole conversation like a spectator at a tennis match, his head turning back and forth between his parents. But now he spoke up. The medicine makes you really sick, doesn't it, Dad? Robert nodded. Yeah, buddy, it does. The chemotherapy kills the cancer cells, but it also kills healthy cells. It makes me feel pretty terrible for a few days after each treatment. That's why I had to cancel those visits. It wasn't because I didn't want to see you. It was because I was too sick to take care of you properly. Why didn't you just tell me? Tommy asked, his voice small. Because you're 10. Robert said simply. You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff. You should be thinking about baseball and video games and what you want to be for Halloween, not about whether your dad is going to live or die. But I found out anyway, Tommy pointed out. And then I had to worry about it all by myself because you made me promise not to tell anyone. Robert winced. You're right. That wasn't fair to you. I'm sorry, Tommy. I thought I was protecting you, but I guess I just made it harder. Linda reached over and took Tommy's hand. How long have you known, sweetheart? 3 weeks, Tommy said. I was looking for my baseball glove at Dad's apartment and I found the papers in a drawer. There were hospital bills and treatment schedules and all these medical words I didn't understand. So I Googled them. Linda's heart broke imagining her 10-year-old son sitting alone with his tablet, looking up words like chemotherapy and terminal and prognosis. I confronted Dad about it, Tommy continued, and he told me the truth. But he said I couldn't tell anyone, especially not you, Mom. He said it would make everything more complicated. He was wrong about that, Linda said, looking at Robert. Keeping secrets always makes things more complicated, not less. Before Robert could respond, there was a knock on the courtroom door. Frank, the bailiff, stuck his head in. Judge Morrison wants to see the attorneys in her chambers now. She said you folks can stay here and keep talking. Patricia Chen stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked like she was still trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Her entire case strategy had just evaporated. Derek Walsh gathered his papers and followed her out. Once they were gone, Linda turned back to Robert. I need to know the details. All of them. What's your treatment schedule like? What are the doctors saying about your prognosis? What kind of support do you have? Robert appreciated that she was being direct. No more dancing around the subject. I have chemo every 2 weeks. Each session lasts about 4 hours. I sit in a chair with an IV and they pump the drugs into me. It's not painful during the treatment, but afterward I feel awful for about 3 or 4 days. Nausea, fatigue, everything tastes wrong. It's rough. Are you going alone? Linda asked. Robert nodded. Yeah. I didn't want to ask anyone to spend their whole day sitting in a cancer center with me. What about after? Who takes care of you when you're sick? I manage, Robert said. But Linda could tell from his tone that managing meant suffering alone in his apartment. That's not okay, Linda said firmly. You can't go through this alone. What about your brother? Your mom? Michael's in Seattle. He's got his own life. And I haven't told Mom. She's 74 and dealing with her own health issues. I didn't want to burden her with this. Linda shook her head in disbelief. So you've been doing this completely alone for 6 months? Robert, that's insane. What was I supposed to do? Robert's voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself and lowered it again. Who was I supposed to ask for help? We were getting divorced. My family's scattered across the country. I don't have a lot of close friends. I just dealt with it. Well, that ends now, Linda said with a determination that surprised even herself. From now on, you're not doing this alone. Robert looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to help you, Linda said. I'll take you to your treatments. I'll make sure you have food in your apartment. I'll help you manage the medical bills. Whatever you need. Linda, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She cut him off. Not because we're married anymore. We're not. But because you're Tommy's father and he loves you and he needs you around for as long as possible. And because despite everything that happened between us, I still care about what happens to you. Robert's eyes filled with tears again. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Linda replied. Just let me help. Tommy looked between his parents, and for the first time in weeks he felt something like hope. Maybe things weren't going to be okay. His dad was still sick, still dying, but at least now everyone knew the truth. At least now they could stop fighting about the wrong things and focus on what mattered. Can I ask you something, Dad? Tommy said quietly. Anything, buddy? How long do the doctors think you have? Robert hesitated. This was the question he'd been dreading. The question that made it all real. They said probably about a year from diagnosis. Maybe a little more if the chemo works really well. Maybe less if it doesn't. So we have maybe 6 more months. Tommy's voice cracked. Maybe, or maybe more. The truth is, nobody really knows. Some people beat the odds. Some people don't. All I can do is keep fighting and hope for the best. Linda was crying again, but she was also thinking practically. What about second opinions? Have you looked into clinical trials? There are cancer centers that specialize in pancreatic cancer. Maybe there are options your doctor didn't mention. I did some research, Robert said. There are some experimental treatments, but most of them aren't available unless you're willing to travel across the country and pay out of pocket. My insurance won't cover experimental stuff, and I can barely afford the standard treatment as it is. This explained so much. The late child support payments. The smaller apartment. The way Robert had looked increasingly worn down over the past few months. He'd been fighting cancer and drowning in medical debt, all while trying to maintain some kind of normal relationship with his son. The medical bills, Linda said. How bad are they? Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. Really bad. I've got about $40,000 in bills right now, and that's with insurance. Each chemo treatment costs thousands, and I've had 12 so far. Plus all the other appointments, the scans, the lab work. It adds up fast. Linda felt sick. $40,000. No wonder he'd been late with child support. He was choosing between paying for treatment that might extend his life or paying for his son's support. What kind of impossible choice was that? We'll figure it out, she said, though she had no idea how. Maybe we can set up a fundraiser or something. People do that for medical expenses all the time. I don't want charity, Robert said stubbornly. It's not charity, it's community support. There's a difference. Linda was already thinking through the possibilities. A GoFundMe page. Maybe his workplace would do something. Her sister Karen had connections to some local organizations. The courtroom door opened again, and Patricia and Derek walked back in. Both of them looked serious. The judge wants everyone back in 15 minutes, Patricia said. She's reviewing some options. But she wanted me to tell you that this hearing is going to go very differently than either side expected. Linda and Robert exchanged glances. They'd both forgotten about the hearing, about the custody battle that had brought them here in the first place. Funny how learning that someone you once loved was dying put everything else into perspective. Before we go back in there, Derek said, looking at Robert, I need to know your goals. Now that everything's out in the open, what do you want to happen? Robert looked at Tommy, then at Linda. I want as much time with my son as possible. However much time I have left, I want to spend it being his dad. Not every other weekend dad. Not special occasion dad. Just dad. And you? Patricia asked Linda. Given this new information, has your position changed? Linda took a deep breath. My position was always about what's best for Tommy. I thought that meant stability and routine with me as the primary parent. But I was wrong. What's best for Tommy is time with his father. Real time, quality time. Whatever we need to do to make that happen, that's what I want. Patricia looked surprised but nodded. Okay, that's good. That gives us something to work with. Derek was scribbling notes. Judge Morrison mentioned something about a modified arrangement. She's bringing in a child psychologist to consult. She wants to make sure we handle this in a way that's healthy for Tommy. Tommy perked up at this. A psychologist? Why? Because this is a lot for a kid to handle, Derek explained gently. Knowing your parent is seriously ill is traumatic. The judge wants to make sure you have support. Tommy nodded slowly. He hadn't thought about that. He'd been so focused on making sure people knew the truth that he hadn't really thought about what came after. Linda put her arm around Tommy's shoulders. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We're all going to get through this together. But Dad's still dying, Tommy said bluntly. That's not okay. No, Linda agreed, her voice thick with emotion. It's not okay. It's terrible and unfair and heartbreaking. But we're going to make the most of whatever time we have. All of us. Together. Robert reached over and ruffled Tommy's hair, something he used to do all the time before the divorce. Your mom's right, buddy. We've wasted enough time fighting. From now on, we focus on the good stuff. Deal? Tommy managed a small smile. Deal. Frank appeared in the doorway again. Judge is ready for you. As they all stood up and prepared to go back into the formal hearing, Linda caught Robert's arm. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For staying alive long enough for us to figure this out. For fighting. For not giving up. Her voice broke. For being Tommy's dad. Robert squeezed her hand briefly. Then they walked back to their respective tables, their lawyers beside them, ready to face whatever the judge had decided. But something fundamental had shifted. They weren't adversaries anymore. They were just two people who loved the same child, trying to do right by him in an impossible situation, and that, more than any legal ruling, was what mattered most. They filed back into the courtroom and took their seats. The atmosphere was completely different now. The tension was still there, but it wasn't the hostile kind from before. It was the tension of people waiting for something important, something that would change everything. Judge Morrison walked in, and everyone stood up automatically. She settled into her chair and gestured for them to sit. Frank took his position by the door. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to record whatever came next. The judge looked different somehow, less formal. Her expression was softer, more human. She'd taken off her reading glasses and set them aside. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. This has been one of the most unusual hearings I've presided over in my career, she began. What started as a standard custody dispute has become something much more complex and, frankly, much more important. She looked directly at Tommy. Young man, I want to thank you again for your courage. What you did today was incredibly brave. You spoke up when no one else would, and because of that, we now have all the information we need to make the right decision. Tommy nodded, feeling his face get warm. He wasn't used to judges thanking him. Judge Morrison turned her attention to Robert. Mr. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you. I'm disappointed that you didn't disclose your medical condition earlier. This is exactly the kind of information the court needs to make informed decisions. However, I understand your reasoning, even if I don't agree with it. Robert sat up straighter. Your Honor, She held up a hand. Let me finish. Your fear that the court would use your illness against you shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're trying to do here. Our job isn't to punish sick parents or reward healthy ones. Our job is to figure out what's in the best interest of the child. Always. That's the only thing that matters. Linda was listening intently, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Mitchell, the judge continued, your reaction when you learned the truth tells me a lot about your character. You immediately shifted from adversarial to supportive. That speaks well of you. Many people in your position would have used this information as ammunition. You didn't. Linda's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. Judge Morrison picked up a document from her desk. I've consulted with Dr. Rachel Wong, a child psychologist who specializes in grief counseling and family trauma. She's reviewed the case file and is available to speak with the family if needed. Her recommendation is that we approach this situation with maximum flexibility and support. Derek Walsh leaned forward slightly. What does that mean exactly, Your Honor? It means we're going to throw out the traditional custody playbook, Judge Morrison said plainly. The standard every other weekend arrangement doesn't make sense here. Neither does a rigid 50-50 split with designated custody days. What makes sense is giving this family the freedom to spend time together in whatever way works best for them, given the circumstances. Robert felt his chest tighten with something that might have been hope. However, the judge continued, we also need to be realistic about Mr. Mitchell's health situation. There may come a time when he's too ill to care for Tommy on his own. We need to plan for that now, while everyone is thinking clearly. She looked at both attorneys. I'm going to ask both of you to work together. And I mean actually work together, not against each other, to draft a custody arrangement that includes several contingencies. Patricia Chen was taking notes. So was Derek. First, Judge Morrison said, counting on her fingers, when Mr. Mitchell is feeling well enough, he should have equal access to Tommy. That might mean several days in a row, or it might mean shorter visits more frequently. The key is flexibility based on his health status. Tommy was holding his breath, waiting to hear the rest. Second, Mrs. Mitchell will retain primary legal custody, which means she'll make the major decisions about Tommy's education, medical care, and so forth. But I expect her to consult with Mr. Mitchell on these decisions for as long as he's able to participate. Linda nodded. That seemed fair. Third, and this is crucial, we need to establish a support system. Mr. Mitchell cannot continue going to chemotherapy treatments alone. He cannot continue managing this illness in isolation. Mrs. Mitchell has offered to help, which is admirable, but we need a more formal plan. Judge Morrison looked at her notes. I'm ordering family counseling. All three of you need to meet with Dr. Wong or another qualified therapist regularly. This isn't a punishment. It's support. Tommy is going to need help processing what's happening. Both parents are going to need help navigating this situation. Therapy isn't optional here. Robert started to object, but Derek put a hand on his arm and shook his head. Don't fight this, the gesture said. Fourth, the judge continued, we need to address the financial situation. Mr. Mitchell, I'm suspending all child support obligations effective immediately. You need every dollar you have for your medical care. Mrs. Mitchell, if you need financial assistance as a result, there are state programs that can help, and the court can provide information on those. Linda spoke up. That won't be necessary, Your Honor. I can manage financially. I just want Robert to focus on getting the treatment he needs. Good, Judge Morrison said. Now, as for the medical bills, I can't solve that problem from the bench, but I can suggest some resources. There are organizations that help cancer patients with financial assistance. There are also patient advocates who can negotiate with hospitals and insurance companies. My clerk will provide you with a list before you leave today. Robert felt overwhelmed. He'd expected to lose this hearing. He'd expected the judge to limit his time with Tommy, maybe even revoke his visitation rights entirely once she knew he was sick. Instead, she was helping him. Actually helping him. Fifth, Judge Morrison said, and this is the hardest part to talk about, we need to plan for the future. Mr. Mitchell, I don't want to be blunt,